two Soviet spies recommend a third Soviet spy to the President of the United States to advise him in his negotiations with their boss. To date, it is our understanding that there were something like 514 Soviet spies in the US government. We saw this kind of thing, for example, when Whittaker Chambers converted to the cause of freedom. Whittaker Chambers was a senior editor of Time magazine. He was a sincerely believing communist. This belief led him to become a spy for the Soviet Union. And he worked as part of a very effective spy ring here in Washington, D.C., and sometimes out of Baltimore. One of the members of the spy ring was the notorious State Department diplomat Alger Hiss. When Chambers converted to the cause of freedom, he turned in the members of his spy ring. He exposed Alger Hiss, but the foreign policy establishment, the intelligentsia, and the media all ridiculed and vilified Chambers and protested the innocence of Mr. Hiss. And Mr. Hiss was not only a spy, he was an agent of influence. He accompanied Franklin Roosevelt to the Yalta Conference, where Roosevelt and Churchill were negotiating with Stalin. How did Mr. Hiss, an upper mid-level official in the State Department, accompany the President of the United States to do this? Well, he was personally recommended to President Roosevelt by two of Roosevelt's associates within the government. One was Harry Dexter White, who was the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, and the second one was Lachlan Curry, who was a senior White House official. Turns out that both Harry Dexter White and Lachlan Curry were Soviet spies. So two Soviet spies recommend a third Soviet spy to the President of the United States to advise him in his negotiations with their boss. Well, you know, there were deep, deep roots of Marxist influence in the government, in the universities, in the media, and in popular culture, in literature, and so on and so forth. The Soviets had a large influence that started in this country during particularly the 1930s, during the Depression, when people felt that the capitalist system, the free enterprise system, had failed and so many people were unemployed. And Marxism of one variety or another became a rather popular ideology. This persisted through the 1940s because the Soviet Union became an ally of the United States, and it was our policy to refrain from telling any truth, or the unpleasant truths about the Soviet system and the numbers of people that they slaughtered, the numbers of people who were imprisoned in the Gulag. And we were helping them, arming them to fight the Nazis. You know, the 1950s roll around and there were still strong, there were still very strong influences of Marxism. Many American authors had written books, for example, sympathetic with the communist side in the Spanish Civil War, calling the people who opposed the communists a bunch of fascists. In higher education, in literature, in spite of the Red Scare. There were lots of influences, and the Red Scare was ridiculed. Joseph McCarthy, who was not the most sophisticated opponent of communism, said that there were some 240 Soviet spies I think in the State Department or the US government. Well, you know, Joseph McCarthy turned out to be actually presenting a significant underestimation. There were, to date, it is our understanding that there were something like 514 Soviet spies in the US government at the time that he was making his charges. But he was ridiculed. McCarthyism is seen even by today's intelligentsia as something that was an unjust set of accusations against innocent people. In fact, he was remarkably accurate. But he did it in a crude and reckless way without having fully solid documentation about everything. And then, of course, the media and the intelligentsia were going to ridicule what he said about these matters. People did not want to confront this. This, created an atmosphere of what I call anti-communism, okay? Where people were opposing the anti-communists, thinking that the anti-communists were more dangerous than the communists. And so this was this was the source of the opposition to Ronald Reagan, anti-communism. But he persisted because he was confident in the moral rightness of his position. And there were people like me and a number of my colleagues in the government who supported him strongly because we believed that a system that murders millions of its own people, that imprisons and makes slaves out of millions more of its own people, is something that should be resisted.